He is the author of the Ottomans, a military history of the Ottomans from Osman to Ataturk, which I'm holding up here. And this is the book we did just the last time he was on last year. And if you want to, you can go check it out after you heard this episode. I highly recommend it, or before. It's up to you. And just briefly to recapture, we talked about this the last time as well, but how did he get into Ottoman military history?
Well, to make it short, I was a professional officer. From a very early age, I showed interest about the military history. But due to some bizarre coincidence, I got my BA from management, MA from politics, and PhD from international relations. My real expertise is war studies, which is a subdiscipline of international relations. But I spent quite a long time in the archives, libraries, conducting research about late Ottoman, modern Turkish military, and most of my publications about military history related. It's a kind of a sliding into the subject. Initially, my interest more global, showing interest in other countries, the modern warfare, etc. But slowly and surely, I slided into late Ottoman era. I published several books, including the one you show to the viewers. My latest book is The Ottoman Army and the First World War. It was published by Routledge. Currently, I am working on several books, one of which would be about the Turkish War of Independence 1919-1922. So slowly I am coming to the modern time period. Hopefully, I will start writing something about the Second World War also.
I'm looking forward to that one. I thought this was, as we are going to discuss the Janissaries today, and we're going to make an episode about this as well soon. I thought it was worth mentioning that, give or take, I know that several Ottoman historians tend to debate when they actually fell, but officially at least, it is 100 years ago this year since the Ottoman Empire officially fell. Yeah.
I mean, there's a growing interest about the Ottoman Empire, especially in the Middle East, but also in Europe and America. I think it is also related with the general fashion about the empires. I mean, if you take a look at the history titles, history book titles, you come across lots of books with the empire term in the title. So British Empire, Indian Empire, etc. And the Ottomans, thanks to the current interest rising from the Middle East and thanks to the centenary, a few years ago, we have the centenary of the First World War. There's a growing interest about the Ottoman history, and people would like to understand some of the famous elements of the Ottoman system, including the Janissaries. And because of the Orientalist literature, there's already a very problematic painting of the Ottoman Empire and Janissaries in particular. And I mean, slave soldiers, it just catches the image of lots of people. I mean, because of the current science fiction movies, books, video games, etc. People feel a kind of a wonder, curiosity about the slave soldiers. Janissaries is a kind of a the ideal, the most elaborate version of slave soldiers.
So how, because this wasn't really a new invention by the Ottomans, but how do, well, we have the Mamluks, of course, which was this failed Abbasid version of the Janissaries. But why did the Janissaries succeed, whereas the Mamluks failed to do what the Janissaries did? Because they ended up in a rebellion, right, and formed their own empire outside the Abbasid Empire. But why did the Janissaries succeed? How did that happen?
I mean, the Janissary is a slave soldier category. And it didn't born out of nothing. It depended on the long Islamic tradition of using slave soldiers. And as you said, in the Islamic empires, it started with the Umayyads, but the real slave soldier concept launched by the Abbasids, the famous or infamous Mamluks. The Abbasi caliphates, they purchased slaves from the northern Black Sea region, Central Asia, at a very young age. They trained them in special training centers. They even constructed a city, Samarra, in Iraq for the slave soldiers, training them, accommodating them, and using them during the peacetime period. But the main difference between the Ottoman system and the Mamluk system was the Ottomans created a well-regulated system, making the Janissaries part of the conventional army of the empire. I mean, the Abbasids and other Islamic nations used the Mamluks as a kind of a central conventional army to control the provincial armies, to control the provinces, because previously most of the military personnel, the military units coming from the provinces, and the governors from time to time use their military units to fight against the Sultan and came to power. In Ottoman system, the Janissaries created as an infantry corps. So it's a conventional light infantry within the organizational system of the Ottoman military. In addition to Janissaries, there were other corps like artillery corps, cavalry, combat sport branches, combat service sport branches, and of course the provincial troops, Timurid Spahis. There are lots of differences between the Mamluk understanding of the slave soldiers and the Ottoman understanding. The Mamluk system depended upon importing slaves from other countries. In the Ottoman system, the Ottomans created a network of conscripting Janissaries from the Christian subject nations, mainly in the Balkans. But from time to time, they also conscripted Christian boys in Anatolia also. So instead of purchasing slaves from abroad, the Ottomans made use of their Christian population, and they created special system in which, without affecting the demographics of the region, they simply took out boys depending upon their age, physical capacity, etc.
What was the age
after,
usually that you would find if you to become a Janissary? To be taken out, what was the age? No, was it 9, younger, teens, early teens?
well, the system called devshirme, that is taking the kids out, they should not be very young, because at that time there were lots of kids disease. So they should be older than 9-10 years old, but they should not be very old, because otherwise you cannot shape the body and the mind according to the military requirements. So they should be lower than 15 years old and higher than 9 years old. And the numbers not very high, because during the classical period, the total number of the Janissaries, initially it started with 1,000, and during the peak of the classical period, the numbers reach around 60 to 70,000 soldiers. So we are not talking about thousands of kids being taken forcefully from their families, but we are talking about dozens or numbers below 50s every year. And after taking these kids, the Ottomans distribute them to Turkish families in Anatolia in order to get learning the Turkish language, but at the same time learning Islam, traditional Turkish lifestyle, and collecting them from the families and putting them into a training center. In this training center, they continue training until there are positions available within the Janissary Corps due to the retirement, killing, disease, etc. So for some boys, this training period may last 10, 15, even 20 years. But some other lucky ones, because of presence of a war, they might just spend 5 or 7 years within the training system. So the nucleus of this system is shaping the body and the mind of the boys according to the requirements of the military. And that
I
was
think
the key of their success.
I think I would be a terrible Janissary. I would probably be kicked out of the court because I would be too lazy to. Nah, I don't want to do it today. I would probably be kicked out. To be fair.
Well, the Ottomans employ lots of methods to make you more eager because when you enter into the system, there's no way out. If they found you not suitable to become a Janissary, they would assign you to others more labor-some combat service support units. And if you are very bright, very intelligent, and physically beautiful, then you might end up in palace schools. They called Enderun. And in palace schools, they educate the future administrative and military high-ranking officers.
But they weren't castrated. They weren't eunuchs in a sense. Like we see in the Game of Thrones series. They weren't like the army you see that Daenerys
No
had.
physical mutilation. There's no physical mutilation. The only thing that would happen when you enter into a Janissary regiment called it Orta, every regiment has a special symbol, and they would tattoo on your left shoulders the symbol of the regiment. And you will in most cases, you will remain in the same regiment until you die or got retired. In some isolated cases, if you change regiment, with a knife, they would cross the old tattoo and you will get new tattoo under the old one. And this is not very honorable to change regiment. It's very unusual for the Janissaries because these boys saw their regiment, the Janissaries saw their regiment as their family. And their father was the Sultan. So Sultan was the father and the regiment was the family. So for a Janissary, the harshest punishment is not capital punishment, but being kicked out of regiment would be the harshest punishment because you are being kicked out of your family.
Something that we should discuss as well, because in Europe after the Roman Empire, there would they would only recruit men for war when they were needed. They didn't have a standing army. So what was really unique at the time as well was that Janissaries would be the first standing army after the Roman Empire.
A first standing infantry corps would be more proper naming. After the Romans, the Janissaries were the first standing infantry corps. And like the Roman legionaries, the way how they live, well regulated system during the peacetime, also during the wartime, the state taking care of most of the needs of the Janissaries, food, clothing, weapons. So weapons did not belong to the Janissaries. Weapons belonged to the state. And when they were sent to a campaign, until they reach the combat zone, they would never carry weapons. So the weapons carried by the special troops called cebeci in carts, and when they reach the combat zone, they will distribute the weapons to the Janissaries.
And this is kind of genius, and because if this would avoid mutiny in the Janissary Corps if they decided that we don't want to fight it for, which would of course happen later, but we are going to come to that. But in at least the early years of the classical period that we're talking about right now, it have kind of avoided a mutiny, right?
There were rebellions. There were rebellions even during the foundation period of the Janissaries. It's an elite troops, elite units, elite soldiers with lots of privileges, but they also from time to time became angry because of their commanding officers, because of the situation, because of the sultan, etc. So there was a series of mutinies even during the classical period, but these rebellions, mutinies became important after Jannisaries gained certain numbers, 20,000, 50,000, and in later periods, more than 100,000 soldiers. And they became, like the Romans, Praetorian guards, protecting the Sultan, but from time to time, rebelling against the Sultan and getting a new Sultan on the throne. So the classical Praetorian issue. And of course, for this kind of rebellions to be successful, there should be leaders. And that was the key of all the rebellions. The normal Janissary mutinies or rebellions were not dangerous. They became dangerous when they found proper leaders able to establish alliances with a faction within the palace, some of the key pashas, important state functionaries, and, if possible, a group of people in Istanbul or where they were rebelling. So the key to success to have a leader and to create an efficient alliance. Without that, the Janissary rebellions would be easy to deal with it.
So how often would a rebellion or mutiny occur?
Not very often, but don't forget we are talking about early modern periods, and rebellions very common in all the militaries. And most often these rebellions start because of the poor quality of the food. Don't forget the state should deliver the food. The salary, because Janissaries receiving salary every 3 months. And early modern age means lots of silver coming from the Southern America, disrupting the traditional economic system, causing an increase in inflation, the value of silver reducing, and Janissary salaries dependent upon the silver. And don't forget, we are talking about medieval style economies, no cash economy. The Ottomans during the classical and later period did not have a cash economy. So finding money to pay the salaries of the Janissaries was a very difficult issue even during the golden age of the Ottomans. So not receiving the salary on time, inflation, long campaigns. I mean, during the Mehmet the Conqueror period, Mehmet who captured Constantinople, because he launched so many campaigns, the Janissaries became very, very angry because most of the time they were campaigning either in the Balkans, in Anatolia, everywhere, including Italy. And because the Ottomans did not have a naval infantry or maritime type soldiers, marines, they made use of Janissaries also for navy campaigns. So you see Janissaries fighting in Malta Island also.
Something I want to talk about is, so you, let's say I'm a young Janissary recruit. I've been taken from a family. I'm arriving in Istanbul. I just signed my unit. What would be the training for a Janissary corps like? What would I go through?
After reaching Istanbul, there would be a selection, taking a look at the physical shape of the boys, their intellect. They will be separated. Some of the bright ones would be picked up for the palace schools. Some of the boys not seen fit for Janissary cause would be given to combat service sport units to become an artisan. And the ones selected for Janissary course would be sent to the training course named Acemi Ocağı. So Acemi means newcomer. And this training, like I said, would spend more than 10 years, because the boys selected for Acemi Ocağı initially sent to the Anatolia to Turkish families. They would spend at least 4 to 5 years with these families to learn language, to learn Islam religion, and then they will return back after 4 and 5 years to the Acemi Ocağı, and at the training course they will receive basic military training, physical training, and depending upon their aptitudes, they may be selected to learn special type of weapons. But during the classical period, all the Janissaries should know archery, because that was the main weapon of the Janissaries during the classical period, and should know how to use sword and spear. When they were selected after graduating from training course, finding empty slots within the Janissary regiments, depending upon their talents, they may be selected for elite regiments, because within the Janissary course, some of the regiments seen as elite, others ordinary line infantry. And when, for example, firearms introduced into Janissary course, initially a few regiments selected to use firearms, where the others continued to use arrows. And some Janissary units had special weapons, like using the Ottomans called Tartar arrow. In English, it is known as arbalete or Genoese arrow. So there was one regiment specially tailored to use this weapon. There were some regiments serving for hunting purposes for the Sultan, taking care of the Sultan's horns, Sultan's birds of prey. So getting into these regiments means you are better than your classmates, your fellow graduates.
What was there a lot of competition to get into this regiment between?
Of course, very, very intense competition, because your future depends on it. In Janissary system, there was no spatial difference between the soldiers and the officers. So you enter as a soldier, private, and depending upon your combat success, your abilities, your intellect, you get promotions. Initially, you become an NCO, non-commissioned officer. Later on, you become an officer. So there was no separate officer course. There was no separate professional military education. So every officer within the Janissary system, except the commanding officer of the whole course, coming from the very basics from the private, reaching ensign, becoming officers, becoming regimental commanders, and becoming more higher.
So, and we should mention this as well, that in Europe, at the time, if you wanted to be an officer or higher rank in military, you had to be born nobility or be very wealthy.
In Janissary system, no.
Mm.
There was a military nobility in the Ottoman system, but that nobility controlled the provincial troops, Timurid Sipahi. So Timurid Sipahi were actually a military nobility. And in addition to Timurid Sipahi, there was some provincial units completely based on feudal system of these regions, especially in the Balkans. But within the Janissaries, no nobility, no special privileges because of your blood. Everything depends upon your capability, intellect, and of course connections. Don't forget, we are talking about early modern world. It is important that you need to build up a social network, and sometimes it is not important what you know, what you're capable of, but your connections, the people who gets you ahead, will play an important role.
So how did you make these connections? What did you have to do to get the right connections?
Especially the connections within the regiments. But after getting promotion to the officer ranks, you need to build up connections with the palace, with the high-ranking officers also. And the campaigns serving in the provinces provide you lots of opportunities to establish good connections with different factions, because although there's one sultan, there were lots of competing groups, cliques, fighting with each other to get better positions, to control the state mechanism. So when you become an officer within the Janissary system, you will have chances to establish connections with these power groups also. But don't forget, the Janissary system did not remain the same. It changed, it evolved. I mean, initially, devşirme, picking boys from Christian families in the Balkans, was the key element of recruitment. At the very early period, they also made use of prisoners of wars, young prisoners of wars selected to serve Janissaries, but they dropped this system and transformed completely to the devşirme. But later on, with the numbers of the Janissaries increasing, the Janissaries, although initially it was forbidden to get married, they started to get married, and they had sons, and they would like to enroll their sons into the Janissary course. So throughout the time, the sons of the Janissaries started to enter into the course, and they became the main source for the Janissary course. So to become a Janissary, you need to become the son of a Janissary. And from time to time, the sultans recruited from other groups in which, according to the classical system, completely forbidden to take. For example, they recruited boys from the Muslim families. It was, according to the classical system, completely forbidden.
But
because,
in the beginning, and we forgot to mention this, I believe, that people hid the families or married off their children at the early age to avoid for them to become in the Janissary Corps. But later on, they started seeing benefits of sending their sons into the Janissary Corps, right? But eventually, Muslim women families would try to send, although it wasn't successful in the beginning, later on, as you said, the Muslim families would also try to see began to see the benefits of sending their kids
Yeah, of
to
course. I mean,
Janissaries.
because the Janissaries became the kingmakers, very powerful, privileged cause, getting good salary, and it became a kind of an attraction point for everyone, especially the people living in Istanbul would like to enroll their sons into the Janissary cause, because not only the monetary financial benefits, but having a relative in Janissary cause means you have a protection within the city. Because later on, after the end of the classical period, late 16th century, 17th and 18th centuries, Janissaries created a kind of a network in Istanbul, or in big cities they are located, and they started to control the dynamics of the city also. Because with the inflation, the reduction of the salaries, the Janissaries unable to survive just depending upon their salaries. So they became low-level artisans, they became low-level laborers, owning small shops, dealing with carrying goods from one place to another. And from the very beginning, the Janissary units tasked with some additional duties. For example, if the Janissaries in Istanbul, they were also responsible for dealing with fires. So fire brigade, they were also responsible for protection of the citizens, performing special duties. They were tasked to protect the embassies, the foreign ambassadors, and there were lots of other duties, including policing the crowds, dealing with markets, selling, buying issues, etc. So they also carried out some of the responsibilities of the municipalities. And after the end of the classical age, especially in 17th, 18th centuries, Janissaries gain immense power in big cities like Istanbul. So being a member of the Janissary means you are a part of the privileged class. You are under
It was like a
protection.
nobility class within
Yeah,
Turkey.
but not like the standard nobility, because not always it is passing from father to son.
Right.
You can enter the core from other places. And in Istanbul, for example, most of the shops having a symbol next to the label showing which Yeniçeri regiment is protecting that particular shop, etc. So slowly and surely, Janissaries transform into a social class, not only a military class, but also a social class. And the Janissaries had special certificate showing that they are member of the corps, and with this certificate they receive their salary. And in 17th, 18th centuries, this certificate started to be sold and sold like stock exchange certificates.
Did
So,
people? Yeah. Sorry. Go on.
so you can purchase a Genesis certificate as if you are purchasing a stock exchange certificate, and every 3 months with the certificate you can get the salary. So it becomes a tool of investment. And interestingly, the Janissaries was the first corps created their pension system, collecting a certain amount of money from each member after each salary. They created a special treasury in every regiment. And after reaching a certain age, or after losing your arm or your leg, you might get retirement, and your regiment continue to pay you. instead of state, you get pension from your regiment. And this system later on extended. So from the very beginning, the Janissaries were part of the economy because the money accumulated at the pension funds being invested for different businesses to gain an extra interest, to gain an extra money. So this pension funding also very interesting aspect of the Janissary cause. So they were always part of the economy, but later on they became a social economic class in big cities like Istanbul. And by becoming a social economic class, they lost their military qualities. And that was the very big problem for the Ottoman Empire because they couldn't able to move the Janissaries out of Istanbul and send them to campaigns.
Now, did people ever try to fake being a Janissary for their own personal benefit? Like they get a costume, steal a costume, and try to portray being a Janissary?
Yeah, of course, of course. I mean, one of the interesting clothing of the Janissaries, they always wear their pants a bit shorter than normal, and, and they tie their pants over their legs, and that was a kind of a visual symbol showing that you are a member of the corps. And there were lots of youngsters imitating this, and if the Janissaries find out that you are fake, you would get a serious beating. But like in any situation, people would like to imitate the fashion of the privileged military units, like the current times in which civilians wearing some special force paraphernalia, special forces, baseball hats, etc. It was like that during the Ottoman period. One thing that I forgot to mention, why the Ottoman state increased the number of the Janissaries, because the Janissaries were expert in firearms. With the changes in the combat, with the increased dependence on firearm carrying infantry, the Ottomans had no other choice but to increase the number of the Janissaries. And with the increase of the numbers, the traditional devshirme, collecting kids from the Christian families, could not work. So they had to enroll the sons of the Janissaries into the corps, and sometimes during emergency period, other groups also got into the corps. And with the numbers increasing, controlling them became a huge problem. So this was also something related with early modern firearm carrying infantry corps system, like in Spain or in Italy, in other states. The difference was, for example, Spanish depended on mercenaries more than having a professional corps. The Ottomans preferred to prefer to increase the numbers of the Janissaries instead of hiring mercenaries. The Ottomans also hired mercenaries, but did not hire in several thousands. They preferred to base upon their conventional military.
Something that I think is worth mentioning as well is that in the beginning, like we said, Janissaries weren't, and there's a reason why they weren't allowed to marry, because if you were married and had a family, you had a reason to come back to, for lack of better words, stay alive to fight for your family. But if you didn't have a family and were not committed to anyone but your core, then you didn't have any. I don't know how else to express this, but you didn't have anything else to live for, so it didn't really matter if you died. You were fighting for Sultan, you were fighting for your core to stay within your core, and there was a reason why you weren't allowed to marry in the beginning, at least.
Yeah, of course. I mean, the regiment was your family, the Sultan was your father, and you show absolute obedience and loyalty to the Sultan, no matter what. And that was the key element of the Janissary philosophy, and that was the reason why the Ottoman sultans created a slave army because that slave army completely depended upon the Sultan. They had no social connections, no family connections to protect them, to promote them. But within the evolution, slowly and surely, Janissaries created their families. They established social connections, and that created a huge problem within the Ottoman political system. And at the same time, they lost their military qualities by spending most of their time for civilian jobs, occupations, depending upon their social connections, and the system later on destroy itself. So when Mahmud II completely abolished and destroyed the core in 1826, very few of them had some military value. So in 1826, the Janissary Corps was actually a social and economic class in big cities.
We will come back to that later, of course, but I want to ask when we talked about marriage and families within the Janisaries, was it if and again I want to use myself as an analogy here. If I married a Muslim woman within the Istanbul or married someone, would that be frowned upon if you were a girl and you married a Janissary, would that be frowned upon by family, or was that the natural prestige?
No, first of all, when the marriage rules accepted, so the Janissaries had the chance to get married, they need to reach a certain age. So not all Janissaries could able to marry. They need to reach an age, generally 35, 36, etc. They receive a special permission from their officers for marriage, and after that, they need to spend certain days within the regiment to participate in training and other kind of military duties. So every week, a few days allow for the married Janissaries to spend time at their homes, but the rest of the time they need to be in the regiment. And of course, during the campaign seasons, the families will remain in Istanbul or other cities remain there. But when the system gain relax more lax the discipline lost, the Janissaries started to spend most of their time at their homes or their civilian jobs, not coming to their barracks or participating in the military training. And it became a reason for most of the rebellions when the officers tried to enforce more strict military training, more drills. The Janissaries rebel against it because they had their civilian jobs to do, and they had their families to take care.
Something that I haven't talked about yet, and we talked about the function of the Janissaries, but I want to talk about the Janissaries on campaigning for now. How because and I want to ask before we go into this. I still talked about sexuality and families, but was there a lot of I mean, I don't imagine there was much, but was there ever sexual frustration between the Janissary Corps? Do we know if there was such things?
Well, there are some examples, but I mean, the Ottoman army, the Ottoman military was very different from the European militaries. So during the classical age, everything well regulated, and don't forget the Ottoman army was alcohol free. So no barrels of wines or liquor following the army.
Well, consider me out then.
And no long tail of prostitutes and other campaign trailers following the army. The Ottomans arranged even the merchants who would join the campaign. So all the merchants had to present a certain portion of their artisanal or other kind of skills into the campaigning army. So, for example, there should be some shoemakers, some leather professional artisans, ironsmiths, etc., to join the army to deal with the needs of the campaigning soldiers. And additionally, the Ottomans, unlike the Europeans, had well established professional combat service support units dealing with the needs of the army. And the Ottoman army also bring them with special merchants who would purchase goods on the road to the battlefield, either in the empire or in enemy territory. These merchants were responsible to purchase goods from the local people and sell them with profit to the army. And Janissaries, because they are privileged, they had priority to buy good items from the merchants, and other troops would buy what is left at the stocks of the merchants. So the campaign system is something like the Romans, well regulated, without the problems of the campaign trailers, hundreds of prostitutes, ill characters, gamblers, or wine or liquors. And in terms of the sexual issue, there were lots of Orientalist tales about homosexual relations between the Janissaries, etc. It was not true. I mean, they had the sexual issues, even the sexual issues, well regulated. And when they camp somewhere, and if they had some time, the officers will give leave to the soldiers so the soldiers can go out, spend some money, and return back. But there was no homosexual chains within the corps in which there were lots of lovers in between. Very few examples.
But actually, no, whenever they besieged the city, they were usually allowed 3 days of pillage in the city, as it was in Islamic law. And did rape ever occur there while we are talking about sexual frustration, sexuality?
Of course. I mean, we are talking about, although highly trained, privileged, professional military, we are talking about early modern period. Okay. So think about what the Europe was during the early modern period. The Ottomans try not to damage the conquer regions, the cities. They try to control this kind of looting, pillaging, but in order to encourage soldiers to fight, they need to give that to them. And that was very standard. But later on, the Ottomans stopped pillaging and looting completely, and they instead assigned special task officers to milk the sources of the conquer region for the benefits of the army. Because the ordinary looting system giving 3 days free looting means no matter the control system, there will be lots of destruction, damaging, killing, etc. But later on, they introduced a very regimented system and taking out the valuables from the conquer city in a regulated way and distributing these valuables to the soldiers under centralized control. But don't forget, the Ottomans were part of the early modern Europe. So everything you are witnessing in early modern Europe, you can find connections with the Ottomans. So they were not isolated. They were not coming from the space. They were part of that social economic system. And they might be better in some aspects, but don't forget, they were part of the early modern Europe.
And let's talk about campaigning. So, because as we spoke about last year when you were on, we spoke about the Ottoman army in general. you agree that the first of usually the Bashibatus were sent first, and then the regular army. But during like a siege or battle, when was the use of Janissary in a battle or siege?
Well, first of all, the Janissaries was not the only combat unit within the Ottoman army. They were part of the conventional military, but in addition to that, there was provincial forces, Timaroid cavalry, and also provincial infantry. Most of this provincial infantry were mercenaries, local mercenaries. In addition to that, there was some auxiliary units recruited from the region or nearby regions. Especially in the Balkans, there were lots of auxiliary elements, Christian soldiers serving at the Ottoman army with their own traditional weapons under their own traditional officers or feudal lords. So the Ottomans get rid of the high-ranking feudal aristocracy in the Balkans, but they kept the middle ranking and low ranking aristocrats, and these guys introduced into the Ottoman military system with special names and serving for the military depending upon their local expertise. So some of them as cavalry, some of them infantry. But later on, after 16th, 17th centuries, all these Christian auxiliary units transform into combat service sport elements, not taking part in actual fighting, but supporting the campaigning army with different services, including transportation, etc. So in a normal battle during the classical age, that would be at the front a screening force consist of provincial cavalry and mercenary infantries. So these were the first guys to fight with the enemy, creating a screen in front of the main army. The Janissaries and most of the conventional military would remain at the center. Provincial troops would be at the wings, at the right wing, at the left wing. So depending upon the location of the battle, if it is taking part in Europe, the right wing would be the European provincial troops and the left wing would be Asian provincial troops. If the battle is taking part in Asia, then the right wing would be Asian provincial troops and the left wing would be European provincial troops. The Ottomans always made use of mercenaries, either part of the provincial troops or specially selected for them. And these mercenaries generally used for dangerous duties. So they were generally the first soldiers to face the enemy. And the Ottomans tried to protect their highly valued Janissaries until the very end, not to show them, not to suffer unnecessary casualties until making the final punch to the enemy. So the Ottoman classical combat system depends upon defense. With the light cavalry, the Ottomans tried to influence the enemy to attack to the well-established center region. The Janissaries established what the Germans called Wagenburg system. That means imitating the Czechs and the Hungarians. The Janissaries remain behind the war carts. These war carts got connected with each other, and these cars establish a kind of a mobile fortress at the battlefield. So the Janissaries generally remain behind it. Some of the Janissaries with heavy weapons, heavy rifles, small artillery pieces placed inside these war carts. These war carts specially designed, having very thick wooden planks with openings for firearms or some large arrows like ballista type weapons. So the cavalry tried to attack the enemy and force the enemy to come forward and assault the Ottoman central line. The Janissary wait behind this war carts Wagenburg and tire down the enemy attack, cause casualties, destroy the enemy assault formation. And when they find out that the enemy is weak enough, they would launch their attack, passing between the special passages of the war carts and attacking them. The Janissaries during 17th century started to practice rolling fire. That means establishing lines with firearms, 5 to 6 lines, and each line firing the enemy, the second line moving forward, firing it, the third line moving forward, the fourth line, the fifth line, and the first line finally loaded the firearm rifles and start firing. This rolling fire system was used many times by the Janissaries, and as far as I understand, they discovered this independent of the developments taking part in Europe, because this rolling fire system first introduced by the Dutch. I don't think there was any connection between the Dutch and the Janissaries about it.
Now, let's talk before we go to the abolition of the Janissaries. And I want to talk about corruption. We spoke briefly about this, but let's talk about corruption within Janissaries. And this is mentioned in Sir Noel Malcolm's Useful Enemies as well, that even in Europe they began to see the corruption in the late 17th century, that how corrupt the Janissaries would be. So how did the corruption happen? Did it happen gradually?
I mean, ordinary corruption was always part of the system. I mean, don't forget, we are talking about early modern Europe, and corruption was part of every system. The Janissary system initially not affected by corruption. The levels remain very low. But when they increased the number of the Janissaries, when they started to employ Janissaries for many things, including putting them in fortresses as fortress guards, using them for internal security duties, dealing with rebels, bandits, etc. And with the changing of the system of enrolling many boys, which according to the conventional system should not be part of the Janissary cause, and because of the economic difficulties, long campaigns, the treasury unable to pay the salaries, debasement of the money, inflation, the Janissaries started to work in civilian jobs in order to survive, having their families. So the whole system transformed. This was not necessarily very bad, because you could not able to find many soldiers with the same quality. So the Ottomans knowingly started to lower the quality, increase the numbers. So increase in quantity, decrease in quality. And of course, with the increase of the quantity, you will face more corruption. And Janissaries now having families, having social connections, becoming part of the big cities' social system, transforming from a military corps to a social economic class. The things we are talking about corruption may not be in reality a corruption. I mean, in classical sources, they accuse Janissaries working as artisans or working as shopkeepers. But these people with their family somehow should have to survive. Their salary is not enough, was not enough, and the government turning a blind eye how they were surviving. And in time, the Janissaries lost their military qualities, and instead of acting like military corps, they act like a social class, and their rebellions transform from military rebellions into social economic rebellions. Unfortunately, most of the modern historians forgetting about this, forgetting that after 17th century, especially during 18 and until 1826, 19th century, beginning of 19th century, we are talking about not a military class. We are talking about a social economic class. And the things you label as corruption, in reality, not corruption anymore. The problem is you could not have an elite corps in hundreds of thousands. I mean, at the
Then it's not an
latest
elite
period,
corps anymore.
we are talking about 150,000, 170,000 Janissaries. I mean, you could not able to create that number well-trained elite troops. We are talking about mass infantry, cheap infantry that you can easily use in the battles. You can easily replace it with new recruits.
And I something we just did justice on the podcast before, but is this as something that as well that Janisaries would be kind of a stopper for in the Ottoman Empire is progress, and is this increase and having families that we talked about, was that part of what made the Janissaries stop the progress of the Ottoman Empire?
Yes, of course, because they had invested interests to protect the traditional system. Because the military reforms that had been introduced into the Ottoman Empire were also transforming the social and economic system, transforming the whole political social system of the empire. So Janissaries, with their invested interests against them. But I think there's a kind of an exaggeration about the Janissary opposition. I mean, the Ottomans able to introduce modern artillery without having any problems with the Janissaries. They created special troops, for example, bombardiers, and there was no opposition from the Janissaries. The Janissaries acted as a social economic class to protect their privileges. The sultans made a terrible mistake when they started military reforms. They tried to create a parallel army next to the Janissaries because they couldn't able to deal with the Janissaries as a social class. They tried to build a new army trained according to the modern European methods, able to use modern weapons, able to employ modern techniques and tactics next to the Janissaries. And that was a kind of a recipe for disaster, because when Janissaries realized that this new army would create a problem for their established privileges, established interests, they immediately rebel. And that was what happened during Selim III period. Selim created a new army, Nizam-ı-Cedid, and the Janissaries rebel against it. Selim could not show the courage to use it as new army. If Selim did have the courage like Mahmud II, the new army could able to destroy the Janissaries completely. But Selim III unable to show that courage, and the new army destroyed by the Janissary rebels. We need to pay attention that Janissary rebels, especially during 18th and early 19th century, mostly social and economic rebellions, because we are no longer talking about a military corps, we are talking about a social and economic class.
Right. So let's talk about the end of the Janissary story and Mehmed II, as you mentioned briefly earlier. And what What was the state of the Janissaries like during the Mahmud's period? Was the Sultan more? Did he feel like he was more a puppet of the Janissaries, or was it like he didn't feel like they were relevant anymore? Because
Well,
it was quite a
until
bloody affair.
until 1770s, the Janissaries had some military capacity until 1770s. But after that date, they were completely useless. So they were useless against the foreign enemies. They were useless against the domestic enemies, rebellions, etc. And 1770 is also the start of the famous Ottoman-Russian wars. The Russian Empire slowly but surely grabbing the provinces of the Ottoman Empire. Initially, the provinces around the northern Black Sea coastline, Crimea and neighboring region, and later capturing the Caucasus, taking it out from the Ottomans. So the Ottoman sultans got into a difficult position. The traditional army they had completely useless against the Europeans, completely useless for internal security purposes, and in fact creating problems because of them. And they had no easy remedy how to take this problematic group out and create a new army. Selim III tried to create a parallel new army and hope to deal with the Janissaries in time, slowly, without making any big fuss. But it didn't work. And Mahmud II waited very long to establish the necessary alliance system, establishing alliance with the civil population in Istanbul, establishing alliance with the religious class, the ulema, establishing alliance with other military corps, the artillery corps and others. He slowly created a network of alliance, and after reaching a certain power, he unleashed this alliance against the Janissaries, and killing most of the Janissaries he managed to capture and solving the problem drastically.
It's
But
quite a genius solution to slowly instead of just dealing with like this. It's quite a genius solution.
well, he was known, Mahmud II, known in Ottoman history as the second founder after the Osman, who initially founded the empire, because Mahmud II destroyed the whole classical military system, and by destroying them, he also destroyed the classical social and economic system. So by removing the Janissaries, not only changed the Ottoman army, but also changed the society, especially in Istanbul. But the problem with Mahmud, he focused too much on destroying the Janissaries. He didn't think much about how to create a new army. So Selim III put focus on creating a new army. Mahmud focused on destroying the old army. So when the Janissaries got out of the system, the empire left without any military troops other than mercenaries. So when the governor of Egypt, Mehmet Ali, rebelled against the Ottoman Empire, there were no conventional military to fight against the governors, and the governors able to defeat the Ottoman armies and nearly reach Istanbul. Britain and France stopped and also the Russians stopped the Egyptians to continue to advance to Istanbul. Without the foreign help, the Egyptian government could able to capture the capital city Istanbul and the end of the Ottoman dynasty.
The world would look quite different if they hadn't interfered, I believe.
Yes, of course. I mean, because that was the design of the Mehmet Ali. He would like to create a dynasty of his own.
And it did.
Well, he did create a dynasty, but only in Egypt.
Yeah.
In a small part. So Mahmud destroyed the Janissaries and had to spend a very long time to create a modern army. And he founded the first military academy, the Ottoman Imperial Military Academy, to train officers according to the European system. He created training centers for ordinary soldiers. He opened up lots of military occupational schools for different military branches. So he was the real founder of the second Ottoman Empire, let's say. But unfortunately, he did not see the benefits of it during his lifetime because he died in 1838 when he heard the news that Egyptians defeated the last Ottoman army in Konya. So that was the tragic end of the Mahmud II.
Would you say that the Ottoman army became kind of irrelevant after the abolishment of the Janissary Corps?
Well, until 1870s, the Ottoman military did not meddle with the politics. So they remain separated from the political system. They remain separated from this changing of the power in the capital city. So they were not part of the political games, political cliques using military to achieve their aims, etc. They were not part of it until 1870s. So that was one of the legacy of Mahmud II. His army, at the beginning, unable to withstand the foreign enemies, but his army was a loyal army, listening all the orders of the Sultan and able to deal with internal enemies most of the time. So that was a big improvement because Janissaries completely useless against the foreign enemies and also useless against the domestic problems. But Mahmud II created an army, and by using that army, he managed to centralize the empire again, dealing with local dynasties, local power brokers, destroying their power bases, dealing with all the rebellions. Although Mahmud's army being defeated by the Russians several times, being defeated by the Egyptian provincial military, he did manage to deal with most of the local players, centralizing the Ottoman system, and his sons and grandsons got benefit out of it.
And we made an episode last year as well about the Ottoman Reformation under Mahmud with Virginia Alexander, which I highly recommend checking out as well.
Yeah, most of the historians focus narrowly on the Ottomans only, forgetting about what is going on in the region, forgetting about what is going on in Europe and world. So when we are dealing with these issues, we need to consider the bigger picture all the time. When you are talking about Janissaries rebelling again and again, don't forget that there were lots of rebellions taking place in Spanish army, lots of rebellions taking place in Britain, actually a civil war taking place in Britain. So we need to see the big picture all the time when we are evaluating the Ottoman military.
Thank you so much for coming on. It's been a pleasure to have you back here. Always welcome to this podcast. If people want to read this book or any of your other books, they find a new book you're working on when it's released, where can people find those?
Okay. Thanks.
But do you have anything you want to promote before you go? Anything social media where people can find you?
No problem, Ayman. You know your business. I'm just a scholar talking a lot. Thank you for the invitation. Hope to see you again. Take care.
Thank you. This has been That Aged Well. We are available on YouTube, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, wherever you can find us. We are also on Twitter and That Aged Well. Please like, share, and subscribe. And I'll see you next time.